Those old cows aren't worth testing, honestly. They haven't been relevant since 1975. Frank Casson said it with a genuine laugh. Not cruel, just the easy laughter of a man for whom the answer is obvious, and his hand swept across the row of Guernsey cows in their stanchions like a man dismissing a room. The barn smelled of warm milk and clover. The cows breathed slowly, their amber eyes catching the morning light in the particular way of animals that are comfortable where they are. Pete Harmon was 67 years old, standing at the far end of the aisle with one hand on a cow's flank. He said nothing. Frank turned toward the door. 34 head, no expansion plan, a breed nobody runs anymore. I'm going to have to recommend pulling the supply contract, Pete. I'm sorry. The laughter was still in the room, residual, like light after the source has moved on. The seasonal inspector made a note on his clipboard. 2 co-op field staff at the barn entrance looked at the floor. But what Frank Casson didn't know, what no one in his co-op had ever checked, was that Pete Harmon's milk had tested at 5.2% butterfat and 97% beta-casein A2 in a blind panel at the University of Wisconsin. And a master grader named Sylvia Roth had been coming to this barn every month for 18 months. Do you know that feeling when someone tells you what you've built isn't good enough, and you know, not hope know, that they haven't looked at it? Let's go back to 1941, to the afternoon Pete Harmon's grandfather brought the first Guernsey to this farm, and what he said about the milk. Carl Harmon was not a romantic man. He was a practical farmer in Greene County, Wisconsin, who had run dairy cattle since 1928 and who made decisions the way practical farmers make decisions, based on what worked, on what the land and the operation actually produced, not on what was fashionable or what the co-op preferred. In 1941, a retired Swiss cheesemaker named Adolf Brenner, who had settled in Monroe and made artisan cheese for 30 years, told Carl over a fence that Guernsey milk made cheese that remembered what the cow ate. Carl wrote that down in his farm ledger. Then he bought 2 Guernsey heifers from a dairy in Fond du Lac for $85. He was not being poetic. He was following the advice of a man who knew more about what made good cheese than Carl did. Carl wrote things down when they were useful, and Adolf's observation was useful. The ledger entry read, Aug 14th, 1941, 2 Guernsey heifers, $85 total. Brenner says the milk makes better cheese. Test it. They tested it. The cheese was better. By 1955, the herd was 15 head. By 1975, it was 42. Pete grew up in this barn, learning what his grandfather taught, milk quality first, volume second. Not as a philosophy, as a practical standard, because the local cheesemakers paid more for milk with the numbers that Guernsey milk produced. The numbers, butterfat and beta-casein. Pete could read those numbers at 3 a.m. in a cold barn in February and tell you exactly what they meant and why they mattered. He had been reading them since he was 12 years old. When the co-op's push toward Holsteins accelerated in the 80s, Pete's father resisted. Pete resisted after him. Not out of sentiment, out of math. The Guernsey milk consistently produced higher butterfat and higher casein percentages than the Holstein milk the co-op was now using as its standard. The co-op didn't pay a premium for that. But Pete believed, with the quiet certainty of a man who has read the same numbers for 30 years, that someone would. He just hadn't found that someone yet. Frank Casson's co-op took Pete on as a contract supplier in 2009 at below standard rates. Frank had been managing the relationship with barely concealed impatience since the beginning, making the breed relevance argument at every inspection. A speech that had several variations, but always the same conclusion. The Guernseys were a legacy operation, economically inefficient, a tribute to a grandfather's preference that the modern market had moved past. Pete listened to every version. He said thank you. He went back to the barn and checked the herd and recorded the morning readings in the quality binder. You've met someone like Pete, maybe, the person who keeps working at something because the numbers say it's worth working at, regardless of what the room says about the numbers. Pete had been keeping the quality binder since 2007. Every butterfat reading, every casein percentage, every seasonal variation, every cow noted by name, 15 years of records when Frank walked into his barn on that May morning. The cow Pete had his hand on was called First. Not a sentimental name, a sequence name. She was the oldest in the herd, 14 years old, the daughter of the first cow Pete had bought when he took over the operation from his father. Pete had delivered First himself in a March storm in 2009, kneeling in the straw for 2 hours with his father's lambing instructions in his head, and First had been in this barn every morning since. She was the standard by which Pete understood what the herd was and what it could produce. He kept his hand on her flank as Frank made his speech. At the co-op's annual supplier meeting in January 2022, Frank gave a presentation on efficiency metrics. One slide showed a scatter plot of herd size versus butterfat yield efficiency, and Pete's farm was in the lower left quadrant, labeled Legacy Operators. Frank said that phrase, Legacy Operators, 3 times in 10 minutes, each time with the sympathetic inflection of a man delivering a diagnosis. Several small farm suppliers glanced at Pete. Pete was taking notes on a yellow pad. What he wrote, in the margin, asked Sylvia about the metric method for butterfat efficiency. He had been corresponding with Sylvia Roth since October. He did not tell anyone this yet. Sylvia Roth was 51 years old, a master cheese grader and quality sourcing consultant for an artisan cheese cooperative based in Madison. She had spent 20 years evaluating milk and cheese quality with the precision of someone who had trained under 3 different European master graders and then built her own methodology on top of theirs. She had encountered Pete's milk as an unlabeled sample in a blind panel at the University of Wisconsin Dairy Science Department 6 months before the January meeting. The panel was evaluating milk samples from Wisconsin operations for a quality assessment program, standard university extension work, the kind of thing that generated data no one outside the program usually cared about. Sylvia cared. She tasted samples 7 of 14. She set her evaluation pen down. She looked at the unlabeled cup. She wrote on her notepad, 5.2% BF, 97% A2. Find this. It took her 3 months to trace the sample through the university's submission records to Pete Harmon's name. She wrote to him in October. He wrote back the same week. They arranged a visit in November. She came to the farm on a Thursday. She spent 3 hours in the barn. She looked at every cow, ran a hand along their sides the way a grader does, reading musculature, fat cover, general condition, and asked Pete about his feeding program, his milking schedule, his stanchion arrangement. She asked for the quality binder. Pete handed it over. 15 years of entries. Every reading, every date, every name. Sylvia read it the way you read something that is both a record and an argument. She tabbed 3 sections with yellow sticky notes. The butterfat consistency run of 2018-2020, the A2 percentage records, and a series of entries from the winter of 2015 that showed Pete's management response to a drop in one cow's production numbers. The response was textbook, feed adjustment, veterinary consultation, 12-week monitoring protocol. And it had worked. The cow's numbers came back to normal within the protocol window. "You've been doing this for 15 years, Sylvia said. "My grandfather started the records in 1955, Pete said. "I took them over in 2007. Sylvia looked at the binder again. "Has anyone from the co-op ever asked to see this?" "No," Pete said. She drove back to Madison and began building the case for a reserve supplier designation. The Madison Artisan Cheese Cooperative had a reserve supplier program, a recognition tier for milk operations that met specific quality standards and were willing to commit to a 3-year supply arrangement at a premium price. The designation required a quality documentation review, a milk panel evaluation, and a board vote. She initiated the process in December 2021. In February 2022, while Sylvia was building her case, Frank sent Pete a formal letter recommending a herd modernization plan, a co-op document that, if signed, would commit Pete to a 3-year transition toward Holstein introduction. The letter carried 2 signature lines, Frank's already signed, and Pete's blank. It was not a mandate. The cover note made clear that continued contract renewal was contingent on demonstrated modernization progress. Pete read the letter. He set it beside the quality binder on the kitchen table. He looked at both of them for a moment. He wrote to Sylvia Roth instead. The modernization letter went unsigned. It sat under the ledger book in the manila folder Pete kept for co-op correspondence. In March, Frank visited the farm for a mid-year check-in. He found Pete in the barn and delivered what he framed as personal advice. "Pete, I've seen a dozen farms like yours. The ones that make it are the ones that adapt. I'm not saying get rid of every Guernsey. I'm saying you need to think about what this farm looks like in 5 years. His voice was warm and paternal. He put a hand briefly on Pete's shoulder. The barn was cold. The Guernsey's breath made small clouds in the air. Pete thanked Frank for coming and offered coffee. Frank declined. After he left, Pete checked the tank temperature, recorded it in the quality binder, and called Sylvia to ask about the designation timeline. 2 months, Sylvia said. Maybe 6 weeks. In April, Frank brought a field rep named Don Merritt, who had never visited the farm before. Frank showed Don around the barn as if conducting a brief tour of something mildly regrettable, explaining the Guernsey breed, its market irrelevance, its lower volume per cow, while Pete milked 6 feet away. At one point Frank said, directly in front of Pete, "The milk is technically fine." It's just not a commercial quantity of technically fine. Don looked uncomfortable. The seasonal inspector made a note. Pete finished milking without altering his routine or his expression. He recorded the volume in the quality binder. The number in the volume column was, as always, small. The number in the butterfat column was, as always, exceptional. If you're watching this right now and you're working at something that the room doesn't see yet, hit subscribe. These stories are about the patience between the work and the recognition. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. On May 19th, the Madison Artisan Cheese Cooperative's board voted to approve the reserve supplier designation for Pete Harmon's farm. 3-year supply agreement. $7.80 per hundredweight. Volume flow guarantee. First right of refusal on expansion. Against the $4.20 Frank's co-op paid, that was $3.60 per hundredweight, a difference that, across Pete's production volume, added up to $68,000 over 3 years. Sylvia Roth signed the certification paperwork on May 20th. On May 21st, she drove to Greene County without calling ahead. She wanted to tell Pete in person. She also knew Frank Casson had the spring co-op inspection scheduled for that morning. She timed it carefully. She parked down the road and waited until Frank's truck was in the yard. At 7:48 a.m., Sylvia walked into the barn. Frank was mid-sentence about contract renewal considerations. She set the quality rating binder on the nearest stanchion rail, Pete's binder, which she had borrowed on her third visit, and returned with 3 yellow tabs marking the sections that had impressed her most. She placed the signed designation letter on top of it, face up. She said to Frank, "I'd recommend reading the first paragraph before you finish that thought." Frank picked up the letter. He read reserve supplier designation at the header. He read the rate, $7.80 per hundredweight. He looked at Pete. He looked at the Guernseys. He looked at the binder, 15 years of quality records, every number in Pete's handwriting, every butterfat and casein reading documented. 5.2, Sylvia said quietly. Average, over 4 years. Frank set the letter down. The seasonal inspector stopped writing. Don Merritt, who was still at the far end of the barn from the April visit, had heard every word. Frank's face went through a sequence of expressions that did not resolve into any of the standard ones. Not anger, not embarrassment, not comprehension exactly. Something more like recalibration. The look of a man whose model has been given a data point it did not have room for. He looked at the cows in their stanchions, the same amber eyes in the morning light that had been here since 1941. He looked at first, nearest the door, Pete's hand still on her flank. He said nothing for a long time. Nobody said anything. Pete wrote the co-op contract's non-renewal in his own calendar in June. He signed the Madison Cooperative supply agreement the following Thursday. He drove to the supply store and bought a new set of dividers for the quality binder because the third section was getting thick and it was time to reorganize. He did not gloat. He did not call Frank. He went back to the barn and milked the herd and recorded the readings and drove to the tank room and checked the temperature and entered everything in the binder. The binder was on the stanchion rail. The designation letter was folded inside the front cover. First was in her stanchion. The morning milk sound was steady in the rafters. 3 other small herd operations in Greene County contacted Sylvia through Pete over the summer. 2 of them were also running heritage breeds, an Ayrshire herd and a brown Swiss operation that had been assessed by the co-op at below standard rates for years. Sylvia evaluated both. She could not help one of them. The records weren't there. The quality wasn't consistent. She helped the other. Frank's co-op revised its legacy operator language in the following year's efficiency presentation after 2 board members raised objections. The language had been accurate in a narrow sense and misleading in every other. The efficiency chart now included a quality per unit metric. Pete's numbers appeared in the upper right quadrant. Frank did not call Pete about the change. Carl Harmon had written, in his farm ledger in 1941, Brenner says the milk makes better cheese. Test it. Pete had been testing it for 60 years, across 3 generations, in the same barn, with the same standard. The result was always the same. The milk was better. The cheese remembered what the cow ate. Someone just had to taste it. The morning of the designation, when Sylvia walked into the barn and set the letter on the stanchion rail, Pete was in his usual position at his usual time doing his usual work. He had not changed his morning because Frank was there. He had not changed his morning because Sylvia was coming. He had not changed it the morning before or the morning before that. He just kept doing what he had always done, and eventually the world caught up to what the numbers already said. Tell me in the comments, have you ever kept a standard when the room told you the standard didn't matter? What was it? And how long did you keep it? Share this with a dairy farmer, a cheesemaker, Anyone who has been told their method is outdated by someone who never tested the product. Like this. Subscribe. Next time. A Kansas wheat field in July, a 1968 John Deere 4020 that a dealer spent 4 years calling worthless, and 19 grain cart runs on the day every new tractor in the county failed. The quality binder was what Pete had reached for during those years of Frank's dismissal. Not as evidence, not then, not while he was simply keeping it in its routine way, but as the ground under his feet. The thing that was certain when the room was not certain. He had started the binder in 2007, the year his father handed over the full operation. His father's transition gift, if it could be called that, was not equipment or machinery or money. It was the comment his father made on the last day he worked in the barn before his arthritis got too bad. He said, "The numbers are in the ledger. They've always been in the ledger. Anyone who wants to know what this milk is worth can read the ledger." Pete understood that he was being told something about patience, about the difference between the argument and the proof. The ledger became the binder. Pete transferred his father's records into the 3-ring format in 2007 and began adding to them monthly. He labeled every section by year and subdivided by cow, because the individual variation mattered, knowing that Daisy's numbers dropped in February every year and recovered in March, knowing that First consistently ran 0.2 above the herd average, knowing which animals in which seasons were pulling the herd above the baseline and which were coming along behind. This was the kind of knowledge that made the herd manageable in a specific, granular way that no co-op efficiency chart could accommodate. Frank's efficiency chart had one axis for herd size and one for aggregate butterfat yield. It was correct in its data. It was incomplete in its story. Because aggregate yield divided by herd size does not tell you what happens when you breed for quality over a generation and hold a standard through seasons when the market doesn't pay for it. It doesn't tell you about the cumulative result of 3 generations of selection, of the specific genetics that Pete had developed in this Greene County barn, of the fact that First's daughters and granddaughters were now producing numbers that no Holstein operation in the county could match. It doesn't tell you that someone in Madison was going to come to this barn eventually. That someone was always going to come. Because the numbers were real, and the world does find real numbers eventually, if you keep them long enough and in a legible format. Pete had kept them for 15 years. Sylvia had found them in 6 months. When Sylvia first visited in November 2021, she spent 3 hours in the barn. After the barn she came inside, and Pete made tea, not coffee. He didn't drink coffee, and set out a plate of cheese he'd made himself from the previous week's cream. A simple fresh cheese that he made in the kitchen, because it was easy. And because it was one of the ways he kept track of what the milk actually produced when it was used for its intended purpose. Sylvia tasted the cheese before Pete explained what it was. She set down her fork. She looked at him. "You make this yourself," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. "From this herd." "Yes." She looked at the cheese again. She was tasting not just the cheese, but the conclusion she had been building toward for 6 months, that the milk Pete produced had a character that was specific and consistent and not reproducible by a different breed on different land managed differently. The cheese tasted like the farm, like the clover and the morning light and the particular genetic line Pete had maintained for 30 years. Like what Carl Harmon's retired Swiss cheesemaker had told Carl in 1941, the milk remembers what the cow ate. "Has the co-op ever tasted this?" she asked. "No," Pete said. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to try to fix that," she said. She meant it in the specific sense of arranging the designation, which she had already begun building. She meant it in the larger sense of making the invisible visible, which is what quality sourcing consultants do when they're doing it right. The designation took 6 months from that first visit. Pete kept his records during those 6 months. He filled out the monthly co-op reports that Frank required. He answered the annual inspection questions. He maintained the herd, repaired 2 stanchions in January when the wood cracked in the cold, adjusted first's ration when her late winter reading dipped 0.1 below her usual average. He did not tell Frank about Sylvia. He did not tell anyone about Sylvia. The quality binder was in the barn. The cheese was in the kitchen. The herd was in the stanchions. He waited. On May 21st, when Sylvia walked in during Frank's mid-sentence and set the designation letter on the stanchion rail, Pete was in his usual position at his usual time, doing his usual work. The morning milk sound was in the rafters. First was in her stanchion. The quality binder was in its place. Everything was exactly where it always was. The difference was that now the room could see it. Carl Harmon had written "Test it" in his farm ledger in 1941 because he was a practical man who believed in evidence. Pete had been running the test for 60 years. The result was in the binder. The result was in the cheese. The result was in the designation letter on the stanchion rail and in Sylvia's voice when she said, to Frank, quietly, 5.2. Average, over 4 years. That number had been in the binder since 2007. It had been in the cow since 1941. Nobody at the co-op had ever asked about it because nobody at the co-op had thought to look. The cow nearest the barn door was first. She was 14 years old, which was old for a dairy cow, and she would not be in the herd much longer. Pete knew this and was already thinking about her daughters, the ones who had first numbers, who would carry the herd forward when first time came. The herd would continue. The binder would continue. The quality would continue. Frank Casson was no longer part of the equation. The morning after the designation meeting, Pete did his regular barn check at 5 a.m. He milked the herd. He recorded every reading in the quality binder. He drove to the tank room and checked the temperature and drove back to the house and made tea and sat at the kitchen table with the binder open to the current month and looked at the column of numbers. 15 years of numbers. 3 generations of cows. 60 years of the same standard. He closed the binder. He went back to the barn to check on first. She was in her stanchion. She was fine. What Carl wrote in 1941 was not a sentiment. It was a research program. What Pete built on top of it was not nostalgia. It was evidence. What Sylvia found in the blind panel was not a surprise. It was the answer to a question that had been asked, patiently and methodically, since the day Pete's grandfather paid $85 for 2 heifers from Fond du Lac and wrote down what a Swiss cheesemaker told him. The milk remembers what the cow ate. If you're running something right now that nobody in your market has figured out how to measure, keep the binder. Keep every number. Someone will come looking eventually. The numbers will still be there. They always are. There is a specific kind of person who keeps records the way Pete kept them, not for an audience, not even for a future argument, but because the records are the only honest way of knowing what is true. Pete's father was that person. Carl Harmon before him. Pete understood the lineage. Each man had passed the habit of careful documentation to the next one, without calling it a habit or a philosophy, simply by doing it themselves in the barn in plain view, so that the next generation grew up understanding that you wrote things down, because things worth doing were worth knowing accurately. Pete had written things down since he was 9 years old. He had started with simple observations: which cow produced the most, which had the strongest temperament, which one calved easily. He had added columns as he got older and understood more: butterfat, protein, somatic cell count. He had added the casein column in 2003 when he read a university extension bulletin about A2 beta casein genetics in heritage breeds and understood immediately why it mattered. He had been tracking the A2 percentage informally since 2005. He had formalized it in the binder in 2007. By 2021, he had 14 years of A2 percentage data on every cow in his herd, including the lineage data that showed how the percentage had increased across 3 generations of selection. Sylvia's evaluation in November 2021 was not the beginning of the story. It was the moment the story became visible to someone outside the barn. The ending of that story, if there is an ending, which Pete doubted, because he thought the story just continued in the same direction it had been going, was not the designation letter on the stanchion rail. It was first, 14 years old, in her stanchion at 5 a.m. On the morning of May 22nd, the day after the designation. Pete checked her first, the way he always did. He ran his hand along her side. He checked her legs and her udder and her eyes. He recorded her morning reading in the quality binder, butterfat 5.4%, which was 0.2 above her usual. Good morning for first. He recorded it and moved to the next stanchion. The morning milk sound was in the rafters. The designation letter was in the front of the binder. The herd was in good condition. Nothing about the morning was different from any other morning in 15 years. And everything about it had changed. What Frank Casson thought, in the days after, nobody could say with certainty. He was not a man who expressed his interior experience to anyone who might repeat it. He ran the co-op. He processed the contract non-renewal at its July expiration. He revised the efficiency presentation for the following year's supplier meeting. He continued doing his job. What he did not do was come back to Pete's barn. He did not need to. The cows were in the stanchions. The milk was going to Madison now. The quality binder was still being kept, every reading every month, every number in Pete's handwriting. The standard had not changed. The operation had not changed. Only the audience had changed. Greene County, Wisconsin, in the fall of 2022, was the same rolling dairy country hills it had always been. The clover came back in the north pasture the way it always did. The Guernseys grazed. Pete milked. The numbers went in the binder. The binder was on the stanchion rail. The designation letter was folded in the front cover. First was in her stanchion. Pete's hand was on her flank. The milk remembered what the cow ate. It always had. In the winter of 2007, the first winter Pete kept the formal binder, he drove to Monroe, the county seat, a town with a history of Swiss cheese making that gave Greene County its dairy identity, and visited the local cheese museum. Not as a tourist. He went because he wanted to understand what the historical records said about butterfat and casein in Guernsey milk relative to the premium cheese production that had made Monroe famous in the 19th century. He spent 4 hours in the archive room. He found what he was looking for in an 1887 creamery ledger that had been donated by a local family, the creamery's payment records, organized by supplier, with butterfat percentages noted beside each payment. The Guernsey operations in the county had consistently received the premium payment tier. The Holstein operations, which began appearing in the records in the 1890s, received standard rates. The creamery manager had noted, In the back of the ledger, a calculation of what the difference represented over a season, approximately 18% more revenue per hundredweight for the premium tier, based on the cheese yield difference. Pete copied the calculation into the back of his new binder. Then he drove home and milked the herd. He never told Frank Casson about the Monroe ledger. He never told anyone. He added it to the binder's back matter along with his own calculations, what the difference between $4.20 and $7.80 per hundredweight represented over 3 years, what the difference between 3.5% butterfat and 5.2% butterfat meant for a cheesemaker's yield per hundredweight. The math was there. The evidence was there. The binder contained everything needed to make the argument. He just didn't make it. He waited for someone else to make it first, because the argument made by the person who benefits from it is not the same as the argument made by someone with nothing to gain but the truth. Sylvia Roth had nothing to gain but the truth, and she made the argument, and it was the same argument that had been sitting in Pete's binder since 2007 and in a Monroe Creamery ledger since 1887. Some arguments take a long time to make. They are still correct. At the Fond du Lac Dairy in 1941, the man who sold Carl Harmon the 2 Guernsey heifers for $85 asked, as Carl was loading them, "Why Guernseys? Co-op's not paying premium anymore." Carl said, "Brenner says the milk makes better cheese." The man shrugged. It was not his argument to make. 81 years later, in a Greene County barn, a master cheese grader from Madison said, 5.2. Average over 4 years. Same argument. Different room. Same result. Pete Harmon drove home from signing the Madison Cooperative Supply Agreement on Thursday and went directly to the barn. He checked first. He checked the full herd. He took the morning reading from the tank and entered it in the quality binder with the date and time and a notation in the margin. New contract. Madison, 780. Then he put the binder back on the stanchion rail and went to make tea. The morning milk sound was steady in the rafters. The numbers were what they had always been. Carl Harmon had written in 1941, "Test it." Pete had been testing it since 2007. The result was the same every month. He closed the quality binder. He went to check on first. She was in her stanchion. She was fine. She was always fine. Tell me in the comments, have you ever kept a record of something that nobody else was paying attention to and had it matter later? I read every comment. Share this with a farmer, a dairy producer, anyone who has been told their method is outdated by someone who never tasted the product. The numbers are in the binder. They've always been in the binder. Like this video. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Next time, a Kansas wheat field in July, 102-degree heat, 3 modern tractors, hydraulic failed, and one 70-year-old farmer on a rebuilt 1968 John Deere 4020, who makes 19 grain cart runs for a widow neighbor, while the dealer who called his machine scrap iron stands and watches from the headland. The seasonal inspector at the May morning meeting, the one who had made a note on his clipboard when Frank said the cows weren't worth testing, drove back to the co-op office after the barn visit and filed his inspection report. In the comments section, where inspectors noted anything unusual about the visit, he wrote, "External designation presented by Madison Artisan Co-op representative. See attached." He clipped a copy of the designation letter to the report. The report went into the file. It was not a dramatic document. It did not change anything at the co-op. But it was there, and the number was in it. $7.80 per hundredweight, reserve supplier designation, Greene County, And when the co-op's board reviewed the supplier base at the end of the following year, two members asked about the Greene County small herd category and whether the co-op's pricing model was missing something. Frank Casson said, "The market has moved. We're tracking the industrial standards." One of the board members said, "The Madison artisan market is paying $7.80 for Harmon's milk. We're paying $4.20. Is that a market we're missing?" Frank said the volume was too small to justify the premium tier. The board member said, "What if we're wrong about what volume means?" Frank said he'd look into it. He did not look into it. The following year's efficiency presentation removed the legacy operator's label from the scatter plot. It was replaced with small herd operations. This was a different label with the same meaning, but it did not have the same resonance in a room where two board members had recently read the designation letter. It was a small change. It was the kind of small change that accumulates over time into something larger, the way the quality readings had accumulated in Pete's binder over 15 years into the argument Sylvia had been able to make in one morning. The world moves in small changes. You keep the records. You wait. Pete kept the records. He waited 60 years, in the sense that the work was his grandfather's and his father's before it was his. He waited 15 years in his own specific tenure. He waited 18 months after Sylvia found the blind panel sample before the designation arrived. He kept going because the numbers said to keep going, not because anyone encouraged him. Because the butterfat reading was 5.2 and the A2 percentage was 97, and those numbers were real independent of what Frank Casson thought about heritage breeds. The numbers were real. They had always been real. They would be real long after Pete and the barn and the Guernseys and the quality binder was someone else's problem. The milk remembers what the cow ate. That's what Adolf Brenner told Carl Harmon in 1941, leaning on a fence in Monroe. Carl wrote it down. His grandson proved it. The cheese cooperative in Madison certified it. And one spring morning in a Greene County barn, a master grader said it to a man who had been saying it without those words for 30 years, and the room finally heard it. 5.2. Average, over 4 years. First was in her stanchion. She was always in her stanchion. The barn was still there in the morning. The summer of 2022 was a good summer in Greene County. The clover came in heavy, which was what it did in good summers, and Pete's Guernseys grazed in the north pasture in the way they grazed in good summers. Slowly, methodically, covering the ground in overlapping passes the way a thoughtful herd does when the grass is where it should be and the animals are calm. Pete walked the fence line on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, checking for any gaps that had opened over the winter, running his hand along the posts and the wire. The fence was old but sound. He had run new wire on the north run in 2018, and the east side had been good since 2014. The south fence along the road was the one he watched. Traffic vibration and road salt and the general hostility of being a fence that faced a county road made the south line the vulnerable one. He replaced 2 posts in June. He recorded it in the farm log he kept separately from the quality binder. The farm log was infrastructure and maintenance. The quality binder was production and milk. He had kept both since 2007 for the same reason, because things worth doing were worth knowing accurately. The farm log entry for June 12, 2022 read, 2 posts replaced, south fence, 3rd and 4th from the gate. New cedar, grade 2. Painted bases. This had nothing to do with the co-op or the designation, or Frank Casson or Sylvia Roth. It had to do with the fence being sound, which was a separate thing and equally important. Pete ran an operation that was sound in its specifics. The fence, the milk numbers, the binder, the stanchions, the breeding program. The morning routine that had not changed in 15 years because it was correct, and there was no reason to change what was correct. Frank had called it legacy. He meant something outdated by that. Pete heard something different. This has lasted. This has lasted because it is correct. The Madison truck made its first pickup in August. The milk was going to Madison. The numbers were what they had always been. Everything else was just the rest of the story.